You think you can't
The
hit
bullet
those
hit steel
targets?
before the general
Watch me.
finished breathing. Nobody
This is how you
expected
aim.
that.
Watch
The
it.
target jerked
ready.
hard,
Hope
a
you
clean
enjoy
hole
it.
punched dead center, and for a half second no one on the range understood what had just happened. The air felt tight, as if it had forgotten how to move. Young soldiers stood frozen with rifles still pressed to their chests, eyes wide, mouths slightly open. The general lowered his binoculars slowly. His jaw tightened. The man holding the rifle was not one of his recruits. Not a lieutenant, not even a private. He was the cook. 78 years old. Thin shoulders, bent spine. White hair peeking out from under a faded cap. The same man who served eggs every morning and scrubbed pots long after lights out. The same man no one ever listened to. The same man who had just fired left-handed with perfect control. The general stared as if someone had rewritten the rules without asking permission. The old man lowered the rifle and stood still, waiting. He did not smile. He did not look proud. His face carried the calm of someone who had been here before, long ago, when mistakes meant body bags and silence meant survival. Around them, the range remained quiet. No cheers. No laughter. Just a growing awareness that something important had happened, and no one wanted to be the first to break it. Only minutes earlier, the moment had felt very different. The general had been pacing the line, boots crunching on gravel, voice sharp with impatience. He had flown in that morning to inspect the base and had already made it clear he did not enjoy what he saw. The soldiers were good, he said, but not sharp enough. Too sure of themselves. Then he stopped and turned. I need one volunteer, he said. Someone who can shoot left-handed. The question hung in the air. No hands went up. Some soldiers shifted their weight. A few glanced down at their boots. Left-handed shooting was not something many trained for. It was awkward, slower, easy to mess up. No one wanted to look weak in front of a general. The silence stretched. Then, from the far side of the range, a hand rose. It moved slowly, but it did not shake. The general turned, annoyed already, expecting to see a young soldier who didn't understand the risk of speaking up. Instead, he saw the cook. The old man stood near the supply tent. Apron folded over one arm, eyes calm. His left hand was raised straight, fingers open, as if answering a question meant only for him. For a moment, the general thought it was a joke. A few soldiers snorted quietly. Someone muttered something under their breath, the kind of laugh people make when they assume they're safe. The cook did not react. He simply kept his hand raised. The general narrowed his eyes. You. The old man nodded once. There was no challenge in it. No sarcasm. Just acknowledgement. The general let out a short laugh. This isn't the mess hall, he said. This is live fire. The cook lowered his hand and waited. Something about that made the general angrier. Most men would have rushed to explain themselves, to defend their choice, to impress. This man did none of that. You're telling me, the general said, voice louder now, that you can shoot better left-handed than any of my soldiers? The cook did not answer. The general took that silence as permission. Fine, he said. Step forward. The old man walked toward the line. His steps were slow but steady. His boots were worn, the leather cracked from years of use. Each step kicked up small puffs of dust, mixing with the smell of oil, metal, and hot earth. As he passed the soldiers, reactions changed. Up close, they could see his hands. They were not weak hands. They were thick with old scars. Knuckles swollen. Skin rough and darkened. Hands that had held heavy things for a long time. Hands that remembered. The cook stopped at the line. Someone handed him a rifle. Unsure whether to feel embarrassed or curious. The weight settled into his grip naturally. He turned it slightly, testing balance. The motion was gentle, familiar, like greeting an old friend you haven't seen in years but never truly forgot. The general crossed his arms. Whenever you're ready, he said, clearly expecting failure. The cook raised the rifle to his left shoulder. The movement was smooth, no wasted effort, no shaking. A few soldiers frowned. This didn't look like guesswork. The cook lined up the sights and paused. In that pause, his mind went somewhere else. He was no longer on a clean training range. He was back in a narrow valley overseas, dirt packed hard under his boots, the air thick with smoke and fear. He could smell burned rubber and blood. He could hear shouting, then screaming, then nothing. He remembered the moment his right shoulder exploded with pain. The way the rifle flew from his hands. The way the world tilted. He remembered grabbing the weapon with his left hand, because there was no one else left to fire. He exhaled, and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck dead center. The range went still. The general straightened slightly, surprised despite himself. The cook fired again and again. Each shot was clean. Control, no rush, no panic. When he was done, he lowered the rifle and handed it back. No salute, no explanation, just silence. The general stared downrange, then back at the old man. How long? He asked. The cook blinked. How long what, sir? How long have you been able to do that? The old man thought for a moment. Since I had to. The answer landed harder than any insult. The general looked at him differently now. Not impressed, not pleased. But what unit? The general asked. The cook answered quietly. A name, a number, a war most of the soldiers had only read about. The general's face changed. Not dramatically, but enough. He had studied that unit in training manuals. He knew the casualty rates, the missions that never made headlines. He knew what it meant to survive that long. The general nodded once. No apology came. None was needed. He turned back to the soldiers. Training resumes, he said. But the tone was different now. Respect had entered the field. The cook stepped away and walked back toward the mess hall. Behind him, soldiers watched in silence. No one laughed this time. No one spoke. Because they had just learned something no manual could teach. And the old man, returning to his pots and pans, did not look back. He never did. The day should have gone back to normal. That was what everyone expected. The cook returned to the mess hall, tied his apron, and began chopping onions the same way he always had. Slow, careful, exact. His hands moved with quiet purpose, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Steam rose from boiling pots, fogging the small windows. The smell of broth and bread filled the room, grounding him in routine. But outside those walls, the base felt different. Soldiers who had laughed earlier now spoke less. When they passed the mess hall, some slowed their steps. A few nodded. One young private stopped himself from making a joke and swallowed the words before they escaped. Respect had arrived without permission. The general did not leave that afternoon as planned. He stayed longer than expected, reviewing reports, asking questions, watching. His eyes returned again and again to the mess hall doors, as if the answer to something he had not yet asked might come walking out. He had spent his life believing discipline came from pressure, from fear, from loud voices and hard stares. But the image that would not leave him was not of a soldier standing at attention. It was of an old man standing calmly while being dismissed. That night, as the base settled into uneasy quiet, the cook sat alone at a small table after cleaning was done. His knees ached. His hands throbbed the way they always did when the air grew cold. He wrapped them around a chipped mug of coffee and stared into the dark. He had not meant to raise his hand. The truth was simple. When the general asked the question, something old had stirred inside him. Not pride. Not anger. Duty. For years, he had kept his past folded away like an old uniform no longer worn. He did not talk about it because talking never brought anyone back. Silence had been easier, safer, but silence did not mean weakness. Across the base, the general lay awake in his quarters, staring at the ceiling. He replayed the moment again and again. The stillness before the shot. The certainty in the old man's posture. The way the rifle had looked like it belonged there. He realized something uncomfortable. He had underestimated the wrong person. The next morning, the general ordered a full demonstration exercise. Word spread quickly. This was not routine training, this was a test. Officers whispered. Soldiers speculated. No one knew what the general intended, only that he wanted everyone present. The cook heard about it while serving breakfast. Sir, a young corporal said quietly, hesitating by the counter, the general asked for you. The cook looked up, surprised. For me? Yes, sir. The word sir felt strange. He untied his apron and followed the corporal across the yard. The sun was already high, heat pressing down, the air thick with anticipation. Soldiers stood in formation again, but this time their faces were serious. No smiles. No jokes. The general waited at the front. When the cook approached, the general studied him closely. How old are you? He asked. 78, the cook replied. And you still work here every day? Yes, sir. Why? The cook thought for a moment. Because people still need to eat. The general nodded slowly. Pick up the rifle. The cook did. This time the general did not mock him. He did not challenge him. He simply watched. Targets were placed farther than before. Distances meant to test younger eyes and steadier hands. The cook took his position. As he raised the rifle again, memories pressed in harder this time. Faces. Names. The sound of a helicopter leaving without enough room for everyone. The feel of dirt packed against his cheek as he fired from the ground, left-handed, heart pounding. He steadied himself. The shots came slower now, but no less precise. When the exercise ended, the range remained silent. The general stepped forward. "You were never just a cook," he said. The cook lowered the rifle. "No, sir. I was just finished being a soldier." That sentence carried decades inside it. The general turned to the formation. "This," he said, "is what experience looks like." No applause followed. None was needed. Something deeper had settled in. Later that day, the general requested the cook's file. It was thin, too thin. Records missing. Commendations never logged. A discharge marked simply complete. The general frowned. Men like this did not leave quietly. They were forgotten quietly. By the evening, officers stood straighter around the cook. Conversation stopped when he entered the room. Not out of fear, but respect mixed with something heavier. Regret. That night, the cook sat alone again, hands wrapped around his mug. He felt the familiar weight of being seen after years of being invisible. It was not comfort. It was responsibility. He knew this feeling. It meant something was coming, and he was right. The third morning came quietly. No announcement, no urgency. Just the soft hum of a base waking up. The cook was already on his feet before sunrise, as he always was. He washed his face with cold water, feeling the ache in his bones settle into its familiar place. Age had a way of making itself known the moment the day began. He tied his apron and stepped into the kitchen. But today something was different. The mess hall was empty. No trays stacked. No cooks arguing over burners. No early risers waiting for coffee. The room felt paused, like it was holding its breath. Then he noticed the note on the counter. Simple. Direct. Please report to the main yard at 0800 U. No signature. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. At exactly 8, the cook stepped into the open yard. Every soldier on the base was there. They stood in long straight lines, uniforms pressed, boots aligned. Officers at the front, enlisted behind them. Even maintenance crews and clerks stood along the edges. The flag moved slowly in the morning breeze. At the center stood the general. When the cook entered the yard, something happened that had never happened before in all his years on that base. The soldiers turned toward him. Not sharply. Not on command. They simply turned. The cook stopped walking. For a moment, he thought he should step back. That he had misunderstood. That he did not belong in the center of all this attention. Then the general stepped forward. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the yard. The cook nodded. "Morning, sir." The general looked out over the formation before speaking again. "This base trains for combat, for leadership, for discipline. But yesterday reminded me of something we forget too easily." He turned slightly toward the cook, but did not single him out with a gesture. "We forget that the strongest people in a unit are not always the loudest, or the youngest, or the ones standing in front." The yard was silent. The general continued. "This man served when many of us were not even born. He carried weapons when he had to. And when he was done carrying them, he carried responsibility instead." The cook felt his chest tighten. He did not like this kind of attention. It felt too close to memory. The general faced him fully now. "I owe you something," he said. The words landed hard. The cook shook his head gently. "No, sir. I don't need." The general raised a hand. "Let me finish." He reached into a folder held by an aide and pulled out a small case. He opened it carefully. Inside was a medal. Old. Earned. Long overdue. "Your records were incomplete," the general said. "They shouldn't have been." He stepped closer and held the case out. The cook stared at it. Images flooded him. Men laughing in the dark. A hand slipping from his grasp. Names carved into metal walls far away. "I didn't do it for medals," the cook said quietly. "I know," the general replied. "That's why this matters." The cook took the case. His hands shook this time. Not from age, from weight. The general turned back to the formation. "This base will remember something else now. Experience matters. Silence matters. And respect is not given by rank alone." Then he did something no one expected. He saluted. The yard followed. Hundreds of soldiers stood in silent respect, hands raised, eyes forward, honoring a man they had once walked past without a thought. The cook stood frozen. He had stood under fire before. He had stood beside graves. He had stood through things that would break most people. This was harder. He returned the salute slowly. When it ended, the general spoke one last time. Dismissed. The formation broke, but no one rushed away. One by one, soldiers approached the cook. Not all at once, no crowd. Just quiet moments. A young private stopped in front of him, eyes down. "I laughed," he said. "I'm sorry." The cook placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't know," he said. "Now you do." Another soldier asked about left-handed shooting. Another about war. Another just said thank you. The cook answered what he could. When the yard finally emptied, he returned to the mess hall. This time he was not alone. Several soldiers followed him in, offering to help. Washing dishes, carrying crates, doing the small work they had never thought to share. The cook watched them quietly. That afternoon, as he stirred a pot of soup, one of the younger cooks looked at him and asked, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" The cook thought for a long moment. "Because the past isn't a warning," he said. "It's a lesson, and lessons mean more when you're ready to learn them." That evening, the general prepared to leave the base. Before he did, he stopped by the kitchen. The cook was cleaning his station. "You could have stayed quiet," the general said. "Why didn't you?" The cook wiped his hands and looked up. "Because someone asked a question," he said. "And I knew the answer." The general nodded. They stood there for a moment, two men shaped by different paths but the same understanding. After the general left, life slowly returned to normal. Breakfast still came early. Pots still needed scrubbing. Coffee still burned if left too long. But the base was not the same. Soldiers listened more, laughed less at the wrong things, paid attention to the quiet ones. And the cook, he went back to being a cook. Just a cook. But now when he walked across the yard, people saw him. Not because of a medal, not because of a rifle, but because they understood something they hadn't before. That strength does not announce itself. It waits, and sometimes all it takes is one simple question to reveal it. The days after the ceremony settled into a new rhythm. Not louder, not dramatic, just different in a quiet, lasting way. The cook noticed it first in the smallest moments. Soldiers held doors open for him now. Not because they were told to, but because it felt right. Conversations lowered when he passed, not out of fear, but respect. Some mornings, a cup of coffee appeared on his table before he even reached for the pot. No one made jokes about his age anymore. No one called him old man. They used his name. He did not correct them when they did, but something inside him softened each time he heard it spoken with care instead of indifference. Still, he stayed the same. He arrived before dawn. He worked until the floors shined and the counters were clean. He listened more than he spoke. When asked about the war, he answered simply and stopped before stories turned into scars. But the general's visit had started something that could not be undone. One afternoon, during a training break, a group of soldiers gathered near the mess hall steps. They sat on overturned crates, wiping sweat from their faces, talking quietly. One of them noticed the cook carrying a box of supplies. "Sir," the soldier said, standing up quickly. "Can we help you with that?" The cook paused. "I've carried heavier," he said. The soldier nodded, embarrassed. "I know. We want to." The cook handed him the box. That was how it began. Not orders. Not speeches. Just shared work. Over the next weeks, the cook found himself surrounded by questions he had never been asked before. How do you stay calm when everything feels wrong? How do you keep going when you're tired all the time? How do you live with things you can't forget? He answered honestly. "You don't forget," he told them one evening, stirring soup while a few soldiers listened. "You make room for it. Same way you make room for pain in your bones. You don't fight it every second. You learn how to stand with it." The words stayed with them, not because they were poetic, because they were true. One night long after dinner was done, a young lieutenant stayed behind. He was new, sharp, ambitious, the kind of officer who still believed rank was the same thing as respect. "Can I ask you something?" the lieutenant said. The cook nodded. "Why didn't you ever correct us?" the lieutenant asked. "When we ignored you, when we treated you like you didn't matter." The cook rinsed his hands slowly. "Because respect forced isn't respect," he said. "And because everyone learns at a different pace." The lieutenant swallowed. "I don't want to be the kind of leader who misses people like that." The cook met his eyes. "Then don't rush past the quiet ones." Weeks passed. The base began to change in ways that never showed up in reports. Younger soldiers helped older ones without being told. Training slowed slightly, but mistakes dropped. Discipline became steadier, less brittle. The general received word of it after he left. He read the updates twice. Then he closed the file and leaned back, staring at the ceiling of his office, thinking of a cook with a steady left hand and a lifetime of restraint. He understood something now. Leadership did not always come from command. Sometimes it came from example. Back on the base, winter crept in. The cook's joints ached more. His steps grew slower. One morning he nearly slipped on the ice near the back entrance. A soldier caught him before he fell. "Careful," the soldier said. The cook smiled faintly. "Gus, I'm not as fast as I used to be." "You don't have to be," the soldier replied. "We've got you." That sentence stayed with him all day. That night, alone in his small room, the cook took the medal out of its case for the first time since the ceremony. He held it in his palm, feeling its weight. He thought of the men who never got old enough to be cooks. The men who never got medals. The men whose names were spoken once, then lost. "I remember," he whispered into the quiet. The medal did not answer. It didn't need to. The next morning, he woke later than usual. Pain pressed deeper into his chest than it should have. He sat on the edge of the bed, breathing slowly, waiting for it to pass. It didn't. By the time he reached the mess hall, his steps were unsteady. A soldier noticed immediately and guided him to a chair. "You're sitting today," the soldier said firmly. The cook did not argue. That afternoon, a doctor examined him. The words were gentle, careful. "You've carried a lot," the doctor said. "Your body's asking you to stop." The cook nodded. He had known this day would come. Words spread fast. The base felt heavier. When the announcement came that the cook would be retiring at the end of the week, no one celebrated. They prepared. On his last day, the mess hall filled early. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, trays untouched. When the cook entered, conversation stopped. He looked around, confused. "What's all this?" he asked. Breakfast was served by soldiers that morning. Every plate, every cup. When he finished eating, he stood slowly. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I just answered a question." A young soldier spoke up. "You reminded us who we're supposed to be." The cook swallowed. When he walked out of the mess hall for the last time, the entire base stood outside. No command was given. They simply stood. And the cook, who had spent a lifetime unnoticed, walked through a path made of quiet respect. He did not look back. He didn't need to. Because this time, he knew. He had been seen. The house was small, too quiet at first. The cook noticed it the moment he stepped inside. No clatter of trays. No voices drifting in from the yard. No early morning whistle of steam rising from metal pots. Just the soft ticking of a clock and the hum of an old refrigerator. He placed his bag by the door and stood there for a long moment, unsure where to go next. Retirement was supposed to feel like rest. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. He moved slowly through the rooms. A narrow kitchen. A worn couch. A single window that looked out onto a modest street where children rode bikes and neighbors waved without knowing his name. The walls were bare except for one framed photo he had carried with him for years. It showed a group of young men standing shoulder to shoulder, uniforms dusty, faces tired but alive. He touched the frame gently. "I made it," he said softly. Somehow. Days passed. He woke before dawn out of habit, made coffee strong enough to remind him of the mess hall, and sat by the window watching the world wake up. His body rested, but his mind stayed alert, listening for sounds that were no longer there. Sometimes he missed being invisible. Other times he missed being needed. One afternoon, there was a knock at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, a young man stood there in civilian clothes, posture still straight, eyes familiar. The young man said, then hesitated. I just wanted to check on you." The cook smiled faintly. "You found me?" "Yes, sir. The base shared your address. I hope that's okay." The cook stepped aside. "Come in." That visit became the first of many. Different faces. Different ranks. Some brought food. Some brought questions. Some just sat quietly, unsure of what to say but unwilling to leave. They didn't call him cook anymore. They called him mentor. One evening, a former private sat across from him, hands clenched. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I don't want to mess it up." The cook nodded. "Fear means you care," he said. "Just don't let it make your choices for you." Word spread beyond the base. A local school invited him to speak. He almost said no. He didn't think of himself as someone who gave speeches. But when he stood in front of the students, he didn't talk about war. He talked about listening. about watching the quiet people, about answering questions honestly when they mattered. The room stayed still. Months later, the general wrote him a letter. It was handwritten. "I built my career on commands," it said. "You reminded me that leadership also comes from restraint. Thank you." The cook folded the letter and placed it beside the photo. Years passed gently. His steps slowed. His hair thinned. His hands shook more often. But when he walked through town, people nodded. They didn't always know why. They just felt it. One afternoon, sitting on his porch, watching the sun dip low, a child from next door asked him, "Were you important?" The cook thought for a long time. "I was useful," he said. "And that's enough." When the day finally came that he did not wake before dawn, the house was quiet again. But far away on a base where young soldiers trained, a question was asked. "Who here can shoot left-handed?" And this time, more than one hand went up. Not because they wanted attention, but because they remembered a man who taught them that silence can carry strength, and that the quiet ones often hold the answers that matter most. The news moved quietly. No headline, no announcement. Just a phone call that traveled from one familiar voice to another. The cook had passed in his sleep. Peacefully. By the time the sun rose, word had already reached the base. Training stopped that morning. Not because anyone ordered it to stop, but because no one could focus. Soldiers stood in small groups, talking in low voices. Some stared at the ground. Some looked toward the mess hall without realizing they were doing it. The kitchen stayed closed. For the first time anyone could remember, breakfast did not start on time. A young sergeant finally broke the silence. He never missed a morning, he said quietly. No one disagreed. By noon, the general knew. He stood in his office holding the phone long after the call had ended. The room felt smaller than it used to. He thought of the range, the raised hand, the calm eyes, the lesson he hadn't known he needed. That afternoon, an order went out. Dress uniforms. Full formation. No explanation. When the soldiers assembled, the flag stood at half-staff. The wind moved slowly, as if even it understood this was not a day to rush. The general stood at the front, his voice steady but lower than usual. "There are men who lead by command," he said. "And there are men who lead by example. Today we honor the second kind." He did not say the cook's name at first. He didn't have to. Everyone knew who he meant. He served without asking for recognition. He taught without giving lectures. He carried strength quietly and gave it freely when it was needed. The general paused. "I failed to see him at first," he said. "That was my mistake. I won't make it again." The formation remained silent. A rifle detail stepped forward, not for show, for respect. Later that week, a small ceremony was held. No crowd. No speeches that dragged on. Just soldiers standing together, heads bowed, remembering a man who never stood in front, but always stood firm. The medal was placed beside his photo. After that, life continued. It always does. But the base was never the same. New recruits arrived, full of noise and confidence. And the older soldiers did something different now. They watched. They listened. They pointed out the quiet ones. In the mess hall, a small plaque appeared near the kitchen entrance. It did not list battles or ranks. It read simply. He answered when it mattered. Years later, a young officer would ask why left-handed training was mandatory on that base. An older sergeant would smile and say, "Because once, a cook raised his hand, and that would be enough." Because stories like his don't need decoration. They don't fade. They wait quietly until someone is ready to listen. The seasons kept turning. Snow came and went. Summer heat returned. New faces filled the base, then moved on. Time did what it always does, erased details. Softened edges, replaced names. But not everything faded. On the firing range, left-handed drills were no longer optional. No one complained. They didn't need to be told why. The explanation lived quietly in the way instructors paused before correcting a stance. In the way older soldiers watched more than they spoke. In the mess hall, the kitchen ran smoothly under new hands. The food was good. The routines were solid. Yet something invisible lingered, like warmth in a room long after a stove is turned off. Sometimes a young soldier would ask about the plaque near the entrance. The answer was never long. "Before your time," someone would say, "but worth remembering." Years later, a storm knocked out power across the base. Generators failed. Radios went quiet. Confusion spread faster than orders. In the dark, with rain hammering down, a young sergeant took charge of his squad. He didn't shout. He listened. He assigned tasks calmly, watched the quiet ones, trusted the steady hands. When it was over, when power returned and order settled back in, someone asked him where he learned to lead like that. He thought for a moment. "I watched someone once," he said. Someone nobody noticed at first. Far from the base in a small town that kept moving, a simple headstone rested beneath an old tree. No long list of achievements, no dramatic words, just a name, just a date, just silence. And that silence was full, because some lives do not echo loudly when they pass, they settle. They become part of the ground others stand on. And long after the questions change, long after the voices grow younger and the uniforms look new again, the answer remains the same. Strength does not rush forward. It waits, and when the moment comes, it raises its hand, quietly, and reminds the world what honor really looks like. Years later, no one could point to the exact moment the story became a tradition. It wasn't written into manuals. It wasn't announced during briefings. It simply lived in the way people behaved. New generals arrived. New officers took command. Each brought their own rules, their own voice, their own pride. But sooner or later, every one of them heard the same story. Not in a meeting, in passing. Usually late in the day, when work slowed and guards relaxed. Someone would mention the plaque, or the left-handed drills, or the reason the mess hall stayed quiet for a moment every morning before breakfast began. And someone older would tell it. About a general who asked a question, about a range full of silence, about a cook who raised his hand. The details changed over time. Stories always do. Some said he was sharper than any sniper. Others said he never missed once in his life. None of that mattered. What mattered was the lesson underneath. That the loudest voice is not always the strongest one. That experience does not need to introduce itself. That dignity survives even when recognition does not. On some mornings, when the sun hit the yard just right and the air felt still, soldiers swore the base felt watched over. Not in a mystical way. In a steady way. Like someone who trusted them to do the right thing without being told. And maybe that was true. Because the cook never really left. He lived on in the pause before a command, in the respect shown to the overlooked, in the calm response instead of panic. Most of all, he lived on in the simple understanding passed from one generation to the next. Pay attention to the quiet ones. They've already survived the things you're still afraid of. And when the moment comes, they will be ready. The years rolled on, and the story of the 78-year-old cook became more than a tale, it became a lesson. New soldiers arrived at the base, full of energy, eager to prove themselves. They trained hard, but every now and then, an older soldier would pause the drills. He would tell them, quietly, about the man who had raised his hand when the general asked a simple question. About how he stood calmly while the world around him doubted him. About how he had carried strength silently, without needing applause, and how that strength had saved lives without anyone realizing it at the time. The recruits listened. At first, some of them doubted. How could a cook teach anything about courage? About honor? But as the stories continued, as they trained and faltered, they remembered. They watched the quiet ones among them. They learned that strength was often hidden, and that listening, patience, and steady hands mattered just as much as speed or noise. The base changed slowly, without anyone noticing. Soldiers helped each other more naturally. Mistakes were corrected without anger. Respect was earned quietly. Commanders who had once shouted for attention learned to pause and observe. Leadership was no longer only about rank, it was about understanding, watching, and trusting. One day, a young officer asked a veteran why left-handed shooting was mandatory. The veteran smiled, eyes softening. Because once, a cook raised his hand when asked, and the world paid attention. That's all you need to know. Long after that, the old cook's legacy lived on. Not in medals, not in headlines, not in speeches, not in noise, but in every pause that mattered, in every hand quietly raised in readiness, in every soldier who remembered that courage and dignity often exist in silence. Strength, they realized, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. Patient, calm, unseen, until the moment the world needs it most. And when that moment comes, it rises, it acts, it changes everything. The story ends not with a hero's parade, but with understanding the quiet ones, the overlooked, the unseen. They are often the ones who carry the world when no one is watching.